all the time. It condenses the session down a little bit, so we will make a start and people will catch up, I'm sure. Welcome to Justice for Colombia Fringe. My name is Sarah Wooler, I'm the General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. The TUC and affiliated unions founded Justice for Colombia in 2003 as a permanent trade union campaign to support social justice, human rights and peace in Colombia. Since then, JFC has worked closely with trade unions, social organisations and civil society in Colombia. I've just noticed you're translating at the back, so tell me if I'm speaking too fast. While taking hundreds of TUC-affiliated trade unionists and politicians to Colombia to experience the situation there firsthand, important campaigns have included providing international support for the 2016 peace agreement, demanding justice for political prisoners and victims of state violence, and working with British and Irish unions to fund specific projects in Colombia. JFC also campaigns in the British, Irish and EU parliaments. The first progressive government in Colombian history was elected in June 2022. The Historic Pact coalition, headed by President Gustavo Petro and Vice President Francia Marquez, and my Colombian accent is horrific, I do know and I apologise. It's had strong support from trade unions, social movements, conflict victims, young people and the pro-peace movement. It was elected on a platform of social investment, peace building, environmental protection, ending corruption and human rights. Core government policies include major social reforms in worker rights, pensions, education and healthcare to tackle inequality and improve social conditions. Amid strong opposition in Congress, only the pension reform has been approved so far. The government is committed to implementing the 2016 peace agreement and reaching new settlements with active armed groups, a policy known as Total Peace. The progressive government inherited a human rights crisis from the previous government, and these stats always kind of just the horrific. Over 1,500 social activists and over 420 former FARC guerrillas have been killed since 2016. And the peace agreement was signed, and shockingly, when the peace agreement was signed, and shockingly more than 100 social activists, including trade unionists, already killed in 2024, which is just, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Colombia is the deadliest country for trade unionists, with more than 3,000 murdered since the 1970s, and that's more than the rest of the world combined. There's a bit of an echo. Is that better? The government's Total Peace policy has received support from the UN, EU and other international organisations. Previous right-wing governments attempted to weaken the agreement, which caused many difficulties and worsened security for former guerrillas. You'll be glad to hear that's nearly enough from me. Before I introduce our fantastic panel of speakers, unfortunately, due to major issues in Colombia caused by a current lorry driver strike, our original speaker, CUT President Fabio Arias, has been unable to travel. But I'm sure you will all join me in sending solidarity to Fabio, and we are delighted that Audi Ruiz could replace Fabio at the TUC at such short notice. Thank you, Audi, for joining us. I'll bring in our first speaker now, Kate Bell, who, as we all know, is the TUC Assistant General Secretary and does wonderful work in supporting Paul leading the TUC. Kate works a lot with external stakeholders and is responsible for inter-union relations, as I know well. Kate, you are very welcome.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks for having me here. It's a real honour and a privilege to be bringing the TUC's support here for Justice for Colombia. One of my other responsibilities, which Sarah didn't mention, is Congress, so I'm really sorry, I'm going to say a few words and then I will have to leave, so apologies for that. So Sarah, of course, talked about how the TUC and unions founded Justice for Colombia, and that was really as a response to the real wave of violence facing trade unionists. And since then, I think that solidarity has grown ever stronger, and the TUC has continued to see Colombia as one of its priority campaigns. We've been really proud to send hundreds of trade unionists to visit Colombia, and I've talked to so many people in the movement about how important that experience was for them, not just to show their solidarity, but to learn from Colombian trade unionists in their organising, their work on peace and negotiation, and their struggle against years and years of violence and intimidation. And I think this is a great opportunity to thank all of those trade unionists, including Aldi, for your inspiration to us and the support and solidarity we've had in both directions. We particularly enjoyed your support when we were fighting the repressive minimum services legislation, where, as Sarah has just said, we now have the first pro-worker, pro-trade union government in Colombia, and they sent us a strong message of solidarity against the repressive attacks on our right to strike, part of an international wave of solidarity that the TUC received, all of our affiliates received, in fighting those repressive laws, which we're so happy to say are now off the statute book. We know that JFC's support was, particularly critical in those difficult years during the difficult peace negotiations, which lasted between 2018 and 2022, where you had that hard right government opposing a peace process. And the TUC during that period campaigned hard to protect that agreement, and we hope we were able to play our part in preserving it. As we've all recognised, you do have that pro-worker government, but we know that the fight for justice and the fight for safety for trade unionists in Colombia, just as around the world, is not yet over. We know that government is facing opposition to its pro-worker, pro-union labour reforms, and we want to commit our solidarity in supporting you to get those rights through your government, to get those rights actually implemented. And Sarah mentioned some of those horrific statistics that we still see of the murders of trade unionists and workers. I think we've had the killings of at least 11 trade unionists in the year up to this summer. That is a statistic that should shock us all. So we are committed to continuing to support you, to make sure that Colombia is a country where everyone can be safe to be a worker, everyone can be safe to be a trade unionist, and we can continue to fight together for better workers' rights. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Kate, and I'm sure nobody will begrudge all the running around you get to do this week, so please do go do what you need to do. Our next speaker is Claire Mellor, who is the Chief Executive of the trade union law firm Thompson's Solicitors, which provides funding and political support for JFC. Several Thompson's lawyers have visited Colombia, including Claire herself, and the firm has campaigned for the liberation of political prisoners, justice for historic state, human rights abuses, and in support of peace. So Claire, you are very welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for that warm welcome. We're a very proud supporter of Justice for Colombia at Thompson's Solicitors, and we've been a proud supporter from day one. I was privileged to attend one of the earliest delegations organised by JFC back in 2006. So on that delegation, we heard testimonies, we saw the way people were living under threat, violence, disappearances. We saw the impact on trade unionists, on social activists, human rights lawyers, journalists, ordinary working people and their families. And whilst there has been great change in Colombia since that delegation, much of those threats remain. These issues, they matter to us all as trade unionists, as people committed to social justice. The values that underpin the work that Justice for Colombia does are the values that we share at Thompson's. We've been closely involved in setting up JFC Northwest, the regional group. 2 months ago, this group sent its own delegation to Colombia, and I know Jeff and Michaela will be speaking about their experiences with you. We've hosted several events now at our offices in the Northwest for JFC Northwest. For those of you who are nearby, please come, please join. You'll be made very welcome. In November, we hosted 2 women who were visiting from Colombia who shared their testimonies about their loved ones who were murdered by the army. And their testimonies, they mirrored what I heard 18 years ago. They mirrored what's been heard since by other Thompson's colleagues and other trade unionists who've attended those delegations. Sadly, terribly, what we heard of all that time ago is continuing now. So there is much still to be done. There is much still to be done in supporting our comrades in Colombia, in supporting Justice for Colombia in the work that they do. We're campaigning for them, we're campaigning for trade unionists, for civil activists, for people like all of us in this room. So thank you to Hassan, thank you to Nick for all that they do, their relentless work, keeping this alive and making sure that we act together. And solidarity to our visitor from Colombia and to all of those people out there facing these struggles.
Thanks so much, Claire, and I know you've got busy schedule this lunchtime too. Our next speaker is Louise Reagan, and she's the chair of the National Education Union's International Committee and a member of its national executive. Colombia is one of the NEU's international campaigns, and Louise, you are very welcome.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by saying that the NEU is absolutely delighted to have been invited to speak on this panel and warmly welcome our comrade Audi from the CUT. We as a union have supported JFC since it was founded in 2003. The NEU is very proud of our international work. We see it as a central and integral part of all the work that we do, and Colombia is one of the NEU's priority countries and will continue to be so until it secures lasting peace, an end to the death squads, and is able to achieve the progressive social reforms that Colombians so desperately want and need. Through JFC, the NEU works closely with Colombia's FACODE, the Teachers Federation. It's the largest single-sector trade union organisation in Colombia, representing around 250,000 teachers. We support them with teachers' rights and public education. In April, we invited FACODE International Secretary Martha Alfonso to our conference. Sent solidarity to Martha after she was threatened in Bogota the following month when she returned. NEU leaders have taken part in human rights delegations to Colombia, most recently in 2022, shortly before the presidential election. And we were pleased that the NEU was represented in JFC's most recent delegation, which we're going to be hearing about in July, when trade union representatives from the Northwest visited Colombia. NEU recently made a large donation, £10,000, towards a school bus for children of former guerrillas in northern Colombia, showing that we show solidarity not just in our words but also in our action. We support a peace building, but education supports peace building, but many children struggle to access schools, and a bus was absolutely vital for that community. We repeatedly spoke out against the former Colombian government, whose armed forces and paramilitary death squads terrorised working people and murdered more than 3,000 trade unionists, with teachers in FACODE one of the regime's main targets. And we warmly welcome the election of President Gustavo Petro's historic pact coalition in June 2022, focused on healthcare, workers' rights, pensions and education. However, we know that while Colombia now has a progressive presidential team, the president does not control Congress, which consistently seeks to block progressive reforms. And we know that the far right, that the neoliberal coalition and the pro-business lobby in Colombia remains strong, and that our sisters and brothers in the trade union and progressive movements continue to need our support. We have condemned legal attacks on FACODE over its support for the current government, and these attacks were led by allies of the previous government. The proposed education reform was based on the principle of education as a fundamental right. However, our sister union FACODE was forced to withdraw its support for the reforms after legislators agreed changes to the bill, which FACODE said enabled the privatisation and marketisation of the education system. This led to 10 days of national strike action by FACODE members that closed schools across the country. We will continue to stand with FACODE as they fight to defend not just their own members, but Colombia's public services, education in particular. Justice for Colombia does a fantastic job in mobilising support for Colombia among the trade union and labour movement, and the NEU will continue to support their work until there is genuine justice for all Colombians. As trade unionists, it's vital we stand with everyone in Colombia, standing up for workers' rights, for peace and for social justice. And the final thing I'll say is this: if your union or your union branch isn't affiliated to Justice for Colombia, make sure you go back and ensure that they are affiliated. Thank you very much.
Louise, I'm always really inspired by just how much international work the NEU fit in with everything else that they do. Our next speaker audit is the CUT Trade Union Federation's Director of Social Security and a member of its National Executive Committee. He was a maths teacher in public and higher education for 32 years, so it kind of follows nicely on, during which he was a leader in the, and I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, I know that, IDMACOR Teachers Union located in northern Colombia. The CUT is Colombia's largest trade union federation, representing more than 700,000 workers, and has strongly supported the Petro government's focus on tackling inequality through social reforms and on peace building and via dialogue. It's also supported Labour Ministry initiatives to combat stigmatisation of trade unionism and create more secure conditions for workers to unionise. Thank you so much for stepping in last minute. You are very welcome.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas.
I'll be translating. Good afternoon, everyone.
Primero que todo, un agradecimiento y un reconocimiento al trabajo que vienen realizando los compañeros por Justicia por Colombia. Gracias por ese acompañamiento en todo este proceso de lucha y de resistencia en la búsqueda de la paz y de la justicia social en nuestro país.
So I want to begin by saying thank you and recognizing all the work done by Justice for Colombia with the support of the trade union movement here. Thank you for all the support you have given to us throughout the many processes that we have gone through, processes of struggle and resistance as we strive towards peace and social justice.
Nosotros seguimos bajo el lema por nuestros muertos, ni un minuto de silencio, toda una vida de lucha y de resistencia.
We say, for all the deaths that we have suffered in Colombia, we give not one moment of silence, and we continue struggling in their name and to pay tribute to all that they did for us.
Constantemente somos sujetos de violencia, estamos en la mira de la ultraderecha, en la mira de los paramilitares que quieren cada vez acallarnos. Diariamente nuestros compañeros dirigentes de la central unitaria son víctimas de amenazas como de asesinatos. En lo que va corrido en los últimos meses hemos tenido más de 12 dirigentes de nuestra central asesinados en varias partes de varias regiones del país.
But the trade union movement in Colombia is under constant attack, the constant presence of violence. This is led by the far right and the paramilitary groups which are still active in the country. They want to silence the trade union movement, and they do this by violently attacking and killing trade unionists and activists. And just in the last few months, since the start of this year, 12 trade unionists affiliated to CUT member unions have been killed.
Después del gran estallido social del 2019-2020, logramos tener un gobierno alternativo, 2020-2022, un gobierno alternativo, como es el gobierno de Gustavo Petro. Eso pues nos ha costado también a nosotros como organización sindical afrontar este nuevo gobierno precisamente por la arremetida de la ultraderecha.
Following trade union-led protests in 2019 to 2022, the largest protest that Colombia had seen in a very long time, we achieved the election of the first progressive government in our country's history, the government of Gustavo Petro. But this election has also provoked the far right, and they remain very active in our country trying to disrupt the progressive agenda.
Nosotros hemos, mayoritariamente la Central Unitaria de Trabajadores y las diferentes organizaciones sindicales del país, hemos venido apoyando al gobierno, hemos venido evitando las intentonas de un golpe de Estado. Recientemente el paro de camioneros perpetuado por la ultraderecha y demostraron esas intentonas de golpe de Estado, pero afortunadamente la Central Unitaria y los movimientos sindicales logramos captar esta situación y frenar esas intenciones. Allí
So the TUC and the member unions in our majority, we give strong support to the government, and we are working hard to avoid attempts led by the far right to enact a coup against the government, to try and topple it even. Recently, in the past week, which is the reason that Fabio Arias had to stay, our original scheduled visitor had to stay in Colombia, was that the far right exploited a strike by lorry drivers to try and disrupt the country. Fortunately, the coup, working closely with other organisations, has managed to resolve this situation, but it does show the challenges facing the government from a very active opposition.
Estamos impulsando el diálogo social con los diferentes sectores de nuestro país. Por ello hemos convocado para este 14 y 15 de septiembre una gran Asamblea Nacional Popular, en el cual van a asistir diferentes delegaciones de todos los rincones del país, campesinos, indígenas, afros, sectores populares, gremios, partidos políticos alternativos, para continuar respaldando, apoyando al gobierno y las iniciativas que se inspiran en la nueva agenda legislativa para este año, para esta próxima legislación.
But we continue the process of social dialogue between all the different sectors in Colombia, the different social movements and the popular groups. For example, this coming weekend, we have a very large National Assembly in Bogotá. And this National Assembly brings together the many different social groups which are behind the election of the government. This is the peasant communities, the indigenous communities, the African Colombian communities, the trade unions, the progressive political parties, all coming together to discuss how we can continue to support the government, how we can strengthen the progressive agenda and actually turn that into laws in the next legislative session.
Hemos considerado que sin movilización y lucha no habrá reformas sociales. Y en ese orden de ideas pensamos fortalecer las organizaciones sindicales para lo que se viene. Están presentes varias reformas. Uno, la reforma laboral, que busca precisamente dignificar el trabajo decente, busca reconquistar los derechos que han sido desvanecidos por la ultraderecha y los gobiernos neoliberales. Una reforma a la salud que garantice la vida y la atención digna de los pacientes.
So we know that without trade union struggle, there will be no social reforms in Colombia. We will not be able to strengthen our union movements. And these reforms are vital to everything that we are trying to do in Colombia. For example, One of these is in labour rights, which looks to provide dignified work and reclaim the rights that were taken from us by decades of neoliberal governments. There is a healthcare reform which promises dignity to all working people in Colombia.
Una reforma agraria que le entregue el campo a quien la trabaja. Hay una política de entrega de tierra para los campesinos, buscando una mayor productividad en el campo y un mayor bienestar para los campesinos, convirtiéndolos en sujetos dignos de trabajo. Pero igualmente una ley de los servicios públicos que genere justicia tarifaria y garantías de un servicio adecuado y digno para la población colombiana.
Another important proposal is the agrarian reform, that land should benefit those who work on it, that land should be distributed to the peasant farmers of Colombia, that we should care for that we should increase productivity, but also the well-being of those who are behind the productivity. That peasant farmers need to have their own bill of rights to protect them as political subjects. And we also have laws that again are trying to ensure that all Colombian citizens receive adequate and dignified conditions.
Asimismo, lo que tiene que ver con el cumplimiento de acuerdos con la FARC y con los diferentes grupos al margen de la ley. Nosotros, primero que todo, felicitamos a los compañeros británicos e irlandeses que apoyaron esta iniciativa de paz en Colombia. Sabemos todos los esfuerzos que han venido haciendo. Nosotros hemos venido exigiendo a través de la movilización el cumplimiento de estos acuerdos.
And also, of course, there is the 2016 peace agreement signed between the Colombian state and the FARC guerrilla movement. That this remains important and it remains at risk, but the government is also trying to advance new peace processes with other armed groups that are still active in Colombia. But I also want to pay tribute and congratulate the British and Irish trade union movement for all the support they have given to peace in Colombia. Your support has been fundamental, and with you we will continue demanding full implementation of the peace agreement and the pursuit of new peace agreements with other groups in the country.
Entendemos de que el camino de la paz es un camino largo y espinoso. Eso nos ha costado mucho más cuando tenemos unos gobiernos de derecha, de ultraderecha, como el gobierno anterior, que hicieron trizas los acuerdos, además de generar un gran hueco fiscal en la que no contribuyó económicamente a la implementación de los acuerdos de La Habana, y para este gobierno son grandes retos en materia económica para avanzar en esta materia.
But we know that the road to peace is long and arduous, particularly following the damage done by right-wing and the far-right governments that we have had in Colombia, particularly the previous government, the one of 2018 to 2022, which was a far-right government and which attempted to rip up the peace agreement. It was completely opposed to the agreement, and it also completely cuts funding for the agreement, which has left the current government with a huge challenge to try and repair that damage, to try and find the economic means to put the agreement back in place.
Se está pensando entonces en una ley de financiamiento para el cumplimiento de los acuerdos de La Habana, mediante una reforma integral del campo, mediante un fortalecimiento de la ruralidad, generando escuelas, centros médicos de salud, mejorar las vías de acceso para que los productos logren salir adecuadamente a las ciudades. En fin, se está pensando en una política digna para la población más vulnerable, las zonas más apartadas del país. Eso.
So another thing the government is trying to do is it's put in place a new law to finance the implementation of the peace agreement. The agreement tackles the causes of conflict. It is very broad in its scope. This includes the issue of reforming the countryside, things like building schools, building clinics, building roads so that peasant communities can take their products to markets. It includes ensuring dignified lives for the rural populations, and that is vital, particularly in rural and marginalised zones of the country.
Entendemos que tenemos un gobierno, un gobierno, pero no tenemos el poder. El poder lo tienen los grandes empresarios, el gran poder del capital que tiene sus aliados en el Congreso de la República y que están para impedir cualquier tipo de iniciativas. Esa es la táctica de la derecha, evitar que progresen las reformas sociales y impedir que esa paz total de la que está hablando el gobierno se vaya dando cumplimiento.
So although we have the government, we do not have the necessary power. The power still lies with the business elites and with big capital in Colombia. And those groups have a lot of allies in Congress. These allies of the right and of the business elite are trying to block any progressive initiatives put forwards by the current government. This is a right-wing tactic to prevent the social reforms from advancing, and it also wants to seek that the government's peace objectives are not met.
Por eso consideramos de que tenemos que buscar una estrategia de fortalecimiento de los sectores populares, unirnos todos alrededor de la búsqueda de un gobierno más potente y poderoso que le dé continuidad a todos estos programas y políticas reformistas para lograr la justicia social y la paz anhelada durante tantos años.
And so our strategy as we go ahead is to keep fighting to strengthen our movement, keep fighting to strengthen and support these policies. We want to unite all of our forces together. We have potency and we have power, if we do that, we can get the necessary potency and power to strengthen these programs, to bring forward the social reforms, and through that we will achieve peace with social justice.
Igualmente estamos llamando al apoyo solidario de los países. El apoyo solidario es importante que nos unamos y nos articulemos para enfrentar esta arremetida de la derecha y de la ultraderecha. Ojalá que todas las voces de los diferentes sindicatos británicos y irlandeses logren sentirse desde sus congresos para apuntar a la necesidad de una paz con justicia social en nuestro país. Así que agradecemos todo el respaldo y apoyo que ustedes han venido dándole a nuestro país y nuevamente a Justicia por Colombia por sus esfuerzos y grandes iniciativas en favor del bienestar y del progreso de nuestro país. Muchas gracias.
Finish just by acknowledging and thanking you for your international solidarity. With that, we can challenge the right and the far right in Colombia, and we are strengthened by all the support we have received from British and Irish trade unions. And we ask you to return to your unions, to your federations, to your congresses, to continue this struggle, to continue your support for peace and social justice in Colombia. And of course, to thank Justice for Colombia for the efforts it has made, but that is only possible, we know, with the support of the trade union movement. But together, we will keep going forwards. Thank you very much.
For that contribution. We it's really important that we hear the realities of what's going on so that we can raise awareness with our members too. We'll move swiftly on. Our next speaker is Paul Fleming, the General Secretary of Equity, which represents, it says around, but I'm going to say over 50,000 workers in the arts and entertainment industry. He's also the Vice President of the International Federation of Actors, the Global Federation of Performers and Trade Unions. Paul visited Colombia on an equity delegation back in November last year. So Paul, you are very welcome.
Thanks so much, and thanks everybody for coming to talk about what is one of the most important struggles for trade unionists around the world. Why is it so important? It's so important because we're winning, and that was the most extraordinary outcome, most extraordinary experience of being in Colombia at the end of last year. I'll kind of start with a bit of an anecdote of the first conversation I had with a Colombian comrade, a Colombian trades unionist, when we arrived. We're bleary-eyed, we're off the flight, and we go to a Palestine solidarity march through the centre of Bogotá. Nick, who was with us, introduced us to a Colombian trades unionist who was in a wheelchair, who had been beaten by fascist paramilitaries, who was covered in acid scars from the abuses that he had suffered. He was an activist in the Agricultural Labourers Union. But on hearing that we were here representing a British trade union, the British Actors Trades Union, all he could exclaim was, "Oh, Suella Braverman, what a shit." I've travelled literally to a different hemisphere, and she's still there. And that interaction sums up the trades unionists we met for those 2 weeks. Their knowledge of, their interest in, and their solidarity with the British trade union movement was extraordinary to experience. And we were there, of course, to see the work of Justice for Colombia, but also for a meeting of our international federation, FIA. We have a Colombian sister union, and through our first week in Colombia working with them, we heard their extraordinary stories of how they've genuinely used their leverage, genuinely used their power to advance the terms and conditions of actors in Colombia. A really great example was how, using the dignity at work issues suffered by their women members, harassment, sexual harassment in particular, and bullying on set, they'd managed to leverage a relationship with Netflix to deliver a collective agreement. It is extraordinary that a union in a country with such a legacy of oppression of trades unions can deliver such an incredible outcome. And it is true that we learn probably more from our Colombian colleagues about the way in which they organise, the way in which they mobilise, than they could possibly learn from us. That said, it has started an extraordinary relationship between us and ACA, the sister union to Equity in Colombia for TV and film. We've had them over in the years subsequently. We're working with them on developing their membership systems. Equity has the second best collective bargaining coverage of any entertainment union in the world. 95% of British TV and film is made on a union agreement. Being able to share those expertise, share our agreement with Netflix, with Apple, with Amazon, using our relationship with the BBC, who's a co-producer in an awful lot of productions that aren't shown in the United Kingdom, to leverage their power and support them in their fight, has been a really important and productive outcome of that trip. But what was really clear, talking to ACA, they are as invested in securing the progressive government and the continuing of the historic pact as every other trades unionist. And considering that the president of ACA, our sister union, is a very famous telenovela star, you can't go to a bar in Bogotá without him being sought out by a lady of a certain age wanting a selfie. It's genuinely being with a celebrity. They have taken an extraordinary step to be so vocal and so supportive of the historic pact as actors in the public eye. And they were very clear with us that the link between peace and justice in Colombia and the trades union movement, they are one and the same. So part of our JFC trip was to go out to Cali to meet young people who were putting on music festivals, cultural experiences, to give people an alternative to violence, an alternative to death, an alternative narrative about where their country should be, what their movement is, and to tell their stories as dignified working people. In the foothills of the Andes, and yes, I did wear a suit for the entire fortnight, in the foothills of the Andes, in my suit, we've got the extraordinary experience of talking to former FARC fighters, brought into the FARC movement through student politics, all art students, all incredibly well versed in Shakespeare, in literature, in art, in poetry, desperate to have a conversation with professional artists who are also trades unionists and comrades. You cannot want to not support them on papaya plantations, on the collective endeavours that are being undertaken by former firefighters in the cause of peace, as a trades unionist, whatever your sector. So I'll leave you with that bit there, I suppose, of our trip. Just before we left, we met an extraordinary woman, a former firefighter herself, the only former firefighter who has become an actor. What did she want to talk to us about? She wanted to talk to us about low pay in theatre. She wanted to talk to us about how she hadn't been paid from the last TV job she had. She wanted to talk to us about the problems for sexual harassment, dignity of work for women on stage. All of that backed up with an incredible revolutionary background in the jungles of Colombia, fighting for peace and justice. Equity's motto is to all artists good work, to all workers good art, and to all people equity. And I cannot think of a country or a movement or a group of trades unions that better embody that mission. If you're not affiliated to Justice for Colombia, do so. If you've not been, go and do everything you can to twin your branches, support the movement, because it's incredibly important to be there as they win.
Paul, for that and for talking about the practical solidarity that your union gives to those in different parts of the world. And it's really important to remember that the issues that our members face are the issues that workers around the world face, and that's why it's so incredibly important to have international solidarity. Our next speaker is Jeff Willits, and he is a National Executive Committee member of the Prison Officers Association. And Jeff visited Colombia in a delegation in July this year, so you've still got your jet lag from there. Jeff, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah said, Jeff Willits from the Prison Association, and I was part of the delegation in July. We visited Palmari Prison near Cali to meet with a group of young men that were detained over participating in the 2021 national strike protests. Just to give you some content, police killed at least 44 unarmed protesters, committed widespread sexual assaults, left more than 80 people with permanent eye injuries, and committed thousands of physical beatings and illegal arrests. More than 300 young men and women were jailed, often with very little evidence. Whilst most have since been released, some others remain in jail, and some have received extremely harsh sentences. In 2023, the United Nations criticised the then government for the use of the anti-terrorism laws against peaceful protesters. JFC is campaigning for the release of these political prisoners and the justice for victims of police violence during the national strike. Shortly after one of our visits, one of the 4 young men we met was released. Our visit contributed to the pressure on authorities and ensured their human and legal rights were protected. We were privileged to arrange a meeting with the UTP union, which is a union that represents prison officers and people that work in prisons in Colombia. With the help of the organisation from Hassan and Nick, we have now established a TUP and POA WhatsApp group. We share information and campaigns with our Colombian colleagues. We hope to establish joint online meetings with our UTP colleagues, and we look forward to building on this relationship. The POA are proud to support JFC, and we ask everybody here to make sure that you affiliate and help JFC help others. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Jeff, for that contribution and for keeping up the time. That's not still for a prison officer. Our next speaker is Michaela Tracy Ramos, Michaela represents young workers on the National Executive Committee of Unison, and is a Unison workplace rep at Liverpool City Council. And Michaela also visited Colombia in July this year. So Michaela, you're very welcome.
Thank you. So alongside alongside with Jeff, I was part of the delegation of trade unionists in the Northwest, who took part in a delegation off the back of the work that Northwest Justice for Colombia had been doing for several years now. And we had meetings with trade unionists, former guerrillas that are part of the peace process, and human rights defenders. We visited cities and rural areas in Colombia, including Bogotá, Cali, and rural territories in Yotoko and mountainous areas near Bogotá. While in Colombia, what struck me the most, both in cities and rural areas, was the sharp contradictions that exist. It's a place of immense resistance and struggle against a backdrop of extreme levels of inequality. The inequality and standard of living, even between the cities and rural areas, was huge, and in the rural areas is where a lot of the civil war can be felt the most. As has been mentioned previously, in 2016, following negotiations in Havana, the largest guerrilla organisation, the FARC, signed a peace agreement with the Colombian government. They're among 13,500 guerrillas in the peace process following the 2016 agreement. While we are in Colombia, we visited Asapunt, which is a cooperative near Bogotá, where former FARC members grow crops and rear livestock. Former guerrillas, conflict victims, and local communities work on this cooperative to develop economic and cultural initiatives. We saw a musical performance by local children who learned about peace and reconciliation in education workshops. It was clear to me how important community is in the reintegration of former guerrilla combatants, and that cooperatives like these are essential in peace building in Colombia. We also visited a coffee growing farm run by former FARC guerrillas in Yotoko near Cali, one of the hundreds of economic projects led by former guerrillas. In this project, signatories of the peace agreement told us how, by learning to grow and roast coffee and getting the necessary qualifications to do so, was essential in being able to reintegrate back into civil society. Today, many former guerrillas earn livings in agriculture, ecotourism, fashion, handicrafts, and beer brewing. It hit home to me how essential decent work and education is in peace building for the signatories of the peace agreement. However, we did hear from these groups around the struggles that they have had with the implementation of the peace agreement. The agreement was badly neglected under the 2018-22 ultra-right government of Ivan Duque, and since then, Colombia's first progressive president, Gustavo Petro, has promoted a policy known as total peace that seeks dialogue with active armed groups over ending the conflict, as well as reinforcing the implementation of the 2016 peace deal. Alarmingly, we also heard that over 420 former FARC guerrillas have been murdered since laying down their weapons and entering the peace agreement. Many more are threatened and disappeared, and those that are fighting for social justice and peace also face this violence. We heard that these former guerrillas that peace is at risk due to a lack of investment in rural communities and land reform for those that work it, including delays to provide housing and essential services to former guerrillas. Significantly, the struggles with implementing social reforms and tackling what they refer to as the root causes of the violence, like inequality, has significantly impeded this agenda for peace. 2 years into the Petro's government, right-wing forces and state institutions that are outside of progressive control have impeded the pro-peace agenda, preserving the causes of violence rooted in social and economic factors. The trade unionists, peace activists and former guerrilla combatants who our delegation met with were clear that the causes of violence must be addressed. Without doing so, the war and civil war continues. Trade unionism should be about challenging the basis of our exploitation and fundamentally changing the society that we live in. In that same vein, our struggle here is not separate from the class struggle internationally. Issues such as peace for all workers should be at the forefront of our political agenda. Solidarity with those working for peace in Colombia is paramount to our struggle in Britain. That's why the trade union movement here must continue to support the campaign work that Justice for Colombia are doing, and peace in Colombia being an important step to peace worldwide. Solidarity.
trade unionists do visit Colombia, do understand about the campaign so that the work continues for generations to come, and I'm sure you will hold that battle. Our next speaker needs very little introduction because he works tirelessly on the campaign. He's here, there and everywhere. It's Hassan, the Director of Justice.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all the panel and all of your unions, or the panel that's left anyway, 3 of you, for your commitment to Colombia, for your commitment to JFC, and all the unions that are represented here, or have been represented here during the session. So many people who champion justice for Colombia and Colombia in their unions, and have done for many years. We are a trade union campaign, founded and fully funded by the trade union movement. Our work is only possible by all of your support and your unions maintaining that support, coming on delegations, coming to these meetings, inviting us to speak at your branch meetings, regional meetings, or other meetings you have, inviting Colombian speakers to speak at your conferences, passing motions, and affiliating branch, regional and national level. That is how the organisation has been able to carry on operating all of these years, over 20 years. It started as a very small thing. Who knew it was going to go on so long? And we are, not in my words, but in the words of what we get told constantly when we go to Colombia, a significant part of the international support of their struggle. We are possibly the most significant international solidarity organisation for these Colombian organisations. So I'll never tire of giving my respect and gratitude to all of you for that support. I'm excited by a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment with many of the people that have spoken today. I just want to mention also about the fact that your support makes a difference. I know that you can sometimes come to an international issue like Colombia or other international issues and they can seem so far away or so huge, and what one can actually do might be so small, signing a letter, writing a tweet, inviting someone to speak. But all of these things form part of a bigger movement. Lots of us are doing it all of the time. It matters, and the Colombians feel it. And I've been involved for 15 years in not just Colombia, but previous stuff as well. And I've seen that time and time again how important that international voice is in supporting these activists and organisations and unions in Colombia. And you also don't need to listen to me or take my word from it. You hear from Aldi, and every time I go to Colombia, and these guys would have heard it as well when they were just there. So I feel it's my responsibility when I'm here with you all to share that, pass that information on, and pass that gratitude on. The changes we've seen when we started in 2002, far-right paramilitary linked governments were the norm. Over 100 trade unions were killed every year. Activists campaigning for peace, just calling for a negotiated solution to the armed conflict, were put in prison accused of supporting terrorism. The idea of a peace deal that we got in 2016 with the FARC, a trade union-backed government that we got in 2022, would have just felt like a complete fantasy. And that change was obviously achieved by the many organisations, unions, activists, and their commitment in Colombia in the face of the huge violences that we know about, that we and you are all part of those changes as well. On a more specific level, just to highlight some impacts that we've had recently, you've heard about the young protesters who were imprisoned. The difference when we visited in 2023 to 2024, in 2023 we went to prison. There were over 300 of these protest prisoners from the 2021 strikes, as they were called. The room was packed, there was 20 or 30 young lads in there. When we came back 1 year later, what was there, 4 or 5? 4. And almost all of them had been released in different ways, whether it was still with some conditions, but that is part of our campaigning, and again we saw the result of our visit, or certainly something that we were contributing to through the visits and through the continued letters. And I haven't told these guys yet, but I've just got a notification yesterday from Darnelli that we're hopeful that David, another of the prisoners, the leader, might be getting released on conditional release this week. We also had a recent campaign to support university workers' strike in the main university in Colombia, the National University. It went on for over a month. Many of you would have met Pacho Tolosa, who was over. He did a very a very quick tour, went to lots of places in a very short amount of time. POA and other unions. He's part of a union called Sintra Unal, and they and the student movement have supported the dean of the university university, but the corruption in the university had seen a different dean appointed. So they went on strike, they campaigned, we supported that campaign. Multiple unions wrote letters to call out this corruption, and eventually that strike was successful, that campaign was successful, and the proper dean, who was supported by the social movements and the unions, was put in place. A third case I'll just mention is one of the most harrowing, I think, I've kind of, in terms of the meetings we often do with victims in rural areas moving on delegation. This was probably one of the most harrowing meeting I had, and it was with the families and survivors of an army massacre. Then, in a very rural part of Colombia, the community were doing a party to raise money to build a road, because there's no infrastructure and that's how they have to do things. It's an area of conflict, lots of armed groups. The army arrived, dressed in balaclavas, dressed in civilian clothing, and opened fire. Word came to us and many others that from the human rights organisations that there'd been a massacre of civilians. The army, the president at the time, which was the last government, defended the action. They admitted it was military. The president tweeted it as an exemplary military operation. We met with, after visiting the victims, we met with ministers. They continued to double down. We met with the Colombian embassy in Ireland and Britain. They didn't double down, but they went completely silent. They refused to admit that they were civilians. 1 year later, after much campaigning inside of Colombia that we were also supporting, 25 soldiers were charged with the murder. When we met with those victims and the survivors and the families, not only were they telling us about the traumatic experience, but also how their lives had been destroyed because they'd been accused of being members of an armed group. And that is what the military had said. It completely destroyed their lives. They all had to leave where they lived. At the very least, we saw some sort of justice in the courts. So these are some of the differences your support makes, giving voice to the persecuted and marginalised, supporting the organised in Colombia. Just in terms of very quickly, I know we're going to have to go back into Congress. You know, we have a progressive government now. But as you've heard, your support and attention is still absolutely essential. We need to support the progressive policies of the government that's backed by the trade unions, around the social reforms, around the many peace processes that they're trying to bring in. We need to counter attempts at illegitimately removing the government and prepare ourselves for what comes next. There's elections in 2026 and it's very unclear what's going to happen. There's no clarity whatsoever there's going to be a continuation of this type of government. So we need to be ready for that. But also, we need to keep our attention on the huge amounts of violence in the countryside. Community activists continue to be murdered, and tragically the violence has gotten worse recently in spite of the peace deal of 2016. The FARC left many of the areas they controlled, and that area was never filled by the state. Multiple armed groups entered, very scrambled now, much less clarity who's in control or not. And as groups move, communities, activists particularly get accused of being the social base of the previous armed groups. We've had 98 community activists killed this year. We've had over 400 signatories, ex-combatants who signed up to the peace agreement in 2016, murdered since they signed that deal. So we have to keep our eyes and support for these communities. Of course, these issues are linked. We have to support peace, not just for the structural changes that are needed and the end to the humanitarian issues of direct armed conflict, but because if we don't have peace, we won't be able to stop the violence against these communities. So thank you so much for all your support historically. That's our areas of focus at the moment. Affiliate if you haven't in your branch or region, and you just get in touch with us at any time if you want us to come down and give a talk, if you want to talk about anything else. Thank you so much.
Because in about 90 seconds the announcements will start to go back into the hall, and we know how disruptive that was from the Fringe meetings yesterday. I hope you've learned about as much as I have during the Fringe from the contributions. As has already been said, please do affiliate, get your trades councils, your branches, your unions to do so, and keep raising that awareness. Thanks to Thompson's for the continued support for Justice for Colombia, to all our speakers, to you for staying, but most of all to the translators, who have not just done a fantastic job during this meeting making sure it's accessible, but you may not be able to see them in Congress. They're doing such a fantastic job throughout throughout Congress, making sure that our speeches and everything that's said is accessible to our international guests. So thank you too, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.